Why does God allow pain and suffering? What's really the big debate between unbelievers and believers? Are we living in a simulation? Up next, Jeff Grupp joins us. His latest work is called God, Faith, next on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. Jeff Grupp with us, pastor at a jail in Michigan, a former atheist, a former Buddhist, and a former college lecturer in philosophy at Grand Valley, Western Michigan, Purdue branch campuses in Indiana, you as well. And he taught philosophy, and more specifically, Eastern philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, and Buddhism. He is now teaching as a video conferencing professor as well in theology at a seminary in Africa. You don't stop, Jeffrey. Welcome back.
Hey, great to be here again. How are you doing, George?
I'm doing fine. In your book, God, Faith, that I can't wait to jump into this with you, because there is this ongoing debate between believers and non-believers. You're someone who obviously is a believer. How do you convince the non-believer about the existence of this divine power?
Well, I think that the convincing is up to God. Really, the person has to be convinced by having a direct experience of God. That would be my take on it. I think that people who think they make a choice, I'm kind of speaking in Christian terms here.
Yeah.
People who think they make a choice and they choose God, I think those people typically don't really, they sort of fall away. I think people have to be taken, overtaken by God, and that's how people are convinced. Now, whether I can say something to someone to sort of impart holiness into them through me, as like I'm a vessel or a channel for God's holiness to overtake someone else, that that kind of thing happens. That's discussed in the Bible. But as far we sort of live in the Bible would say we live in a reality that's not a reality of chance. In many ways, the Bible and what we're taught in the mainstream culture are the opposite. And sort of the reason for that is because the world is a world that is the opposite of God in many ways. It says that in John 7:7. Now, let me get right to a real huge critical point. This is in my new book, God, Faith, which is subtitled Discovering the Pure Logic Built into the Fabric of Reality. And that book, that's actually the result of me working in the jail that I work at.
Yeah, and whereabouts in Michigan? That's my home state.
Kalamazoo, Kalamazoo County Jail.
Know it well.
Yep.
Know it well.
Yeah, I used to live over in Detroit and taught at University of Michigan and at University of Detroit.
Yeah, I went to U of D.
Yeah, yep, I remember. Yeah, yeah, those are great places. And
that's cool.
But in the jail, I used to be an atheist, and one of the main reasons I was an atheist is because the world is such a mess, and my life was filled with pain and misery, and no God would create a world like this, right? And this is a question I was confronted with regularly when I started working in the jail. And I didn't have an answer, and it was very disturbing to me. So I don't want to get too overly churchy on you, but I just have to tell it like it is. So I prayed on this, and I said, I need answers. I got guys saying to me, if your God exists, why am I here in pain and misery every day, day in, day out? This couldn't be worse. And, I'm tucking my tail between my legs and walking away with no answer. So I started praying for answers to those questions and several others. And I wanted real answers, not, wishful thinking, answers that kind of cut the corners, don't really convince. I was, I'm saying, talking right to God, saying, I need the real story on these answers. I need to be able to say them in about 10 seconds, and they need to be convincing because they're the truth. And when I started saying these prayers, this started about August last year. A couple things happened. One, I didn't realize that they were already being answered. That's written in the Bible. It says a lot of your prayers are answered before you pray them. And some of them were being answered 20 years before, which I didn't realize even a little bit until the last few months as the book was getting finished. But anyways, let me give you a story of one of these. One of the first answers that came to me, somebody's going to have to explain to me, George, why nobody's thought of this
okay.
before. I've been studying theology from seminary pretty much full-time for 4 years. And I taught for 13 years. I was the main critical thinking professor at University of Michigan Dearborn for 4.5 years. So I don't know why nobody's thought of this. But let me give you one example of an argument. Well, the big one I really wanted right away, which is the one that was first delivered to me, I would say by divine inspiration, and that was why do we live in such a mess world? Why is there pain and suffering? Why is there evil? And this is called the problem of evil, and you can go listen to the great theologians of today, John Piper, R.C. Sproul, who just died recently, a couple years ago. These are the big, famous theologians. They'll tell you there's no solution. John Calvin, Augustine, Luther, none of these guys could figure out why there's this great loving God and creates a world that's such a disaster, such a mess, pain and suffering everywhere. And so check this out, George. Here's the answer. The book. This is chapter 2.
There we go. Earth-shattering answer here.
it's you can do it in about 10 seconds. Like I prayed for it. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that God, what He creates, is perfect. God is perfect. If He creates something different from Himself, He creates something that's not perfect. It can't be. If it's more perfect, it's more God. So it's got to be imperfect, good, but not perfect. So therefore, that which is not perfect is susceptible to corruption. And in some universes, such as ours, the corruption will spiral in the way where you have pain, suffering, sin, and evil. And it's an astonishingly simple answer. And I go into I have 3 versions of the argument in chapter 2. And I sort of lead in the chapter, you want to get to the 10-second version, which is the one I just gave. That's supposed to be, if you're in a ministry setting, you want to be able to lay that on someone who's really coming at you. Say if you're talking to an atheist or something.
Sure.
But there's a longer version of it that spells it out in great detail. But that should be absolutely ironclad. That should mean that any reality that God creates is probably going to look just like this. What does that mean? That means that the reality that God creates has to be saved by God, because it can't be perfected. So it will have to be made perfected in some way where it stays in its own individual self, so it doesn't just become more of God.
What is God to you, Jeffrey? In your opinion, if you can describe God for us.
The first thing that came to my mind when you said that is the creator of everything at every moment, that is an omnipresent light, which I'm meant to experience all the time. That's sort of the whole part 3 of the book that I just finished,
right.
God Faith. God is, if you read the Bible, I discovered Christ, Jesus, through Buddhism, which is... And
you were an atheist in the beginning, weren't you?
Yeah, well, yeah. Mm-hmm. I definitely, I published a paper when I was teaching down in Purdue, when I was a graduate student, PhD student there as well. I published a paper on atheism.
What an amazing turnabout for you.
Well, that's what I discussed when I was on your show in January, on the 6th, about how that, I had my wife became a Christian and blah, 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 and then she sort of convinced me into saying a prayer, and I did, and then look out, the whole earth fell apart.
It worked for you, though.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a vision, or a series of visions over 4 months, that tends to overturn. So I knew all the atheist arguments. I knew how ridiculous Christianity sounds to someone who's not in it, who doesn't have experience of God. And so then all of a sudden there I am as a Christian trying to figure out what do I do now? I know how ridiculous it is, but I've just seen the truth. So, as I saw it according to the series of visions I saw, a number of years ago when this all happened. So, I've got to make sense of it. And that's kind of what this book is. It started in this book I wrote called Theologic last year. Then this book is sort of the much bigger follow-up to that, which has really been brewing. Some of the work that I've done that this book involves, I was doing actually. So I prayed for this book to happen, which really is a way to explain how the whole God thing works in the scientific age.
But let me ask you this, Jeff, because somebody brought this up. I was at an event this weekend, and somebody brought up God and said, how could God, this loving God, have so much havoc on this planet dying children, things that happen, the mass shootings that just happened in Virginia Beach. How does a loving God permit this to happen? Doesn't he, I say he in a general sense, have the ability to stop these things?
Only to the conclusion I come to in chapters 2 and 3 of the book say that there's a limited amount of he does do some regular stoppage, and that's discussed very heavily in the Bible about God's constantly managing and curbing. Luke 14:11, I think it is, talking about those who are not humble and make humble and so forth. But there has to be a limited amount of his power he imparts into the creation that he makes, because if not, he'll make the creation resemble himself too much. So therefore, it won't be a genuinely distinct created entity. If God's going to create something, if God's perfect and God's going to create something, it has to be distinct, truly distinct from him, if it's a genuine creation and not just more of himself. Which, when I say more of himself, God's infinite, so there'd just be more infinite. So which means that, nothing happens. If an infinite being creates more of himself, then nothing happened, because infinite is still infinite.
But I don't think he can stop these things.
Pardon me?
I don't think he can stop these things from happening.
Well, the answer I just gave would imply that if he does too much stoppage, then the creation just starts to be permeated too much with him, where it's not a genuine creation. It's more of just God activity, where it's not truly separate. You don't have an actual created thing. You've just got more of God.
Well, here's case in point. Why doesn't he have Hitler die of a heart attack in 1940 instead of going through all that horror that everybody had to go through?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's really, if you look at all of reality everywhere. I was just watching a video the other day of the slums in India. Somebody's on a train just for miles and miles and miles and miles. They must have gone 100 miles. Kids playing on the track, just unfathomable poverty. And I'm thinking the whole world, I just got done reading the book of 2 Kings in the Bible. It reads like the most bleak, dystopian Hollywood film ever.
It's horrible.
Yeah, so the whole world is of this nature.
What does that tell you?
That the only point in our life is to be in our inner core, to be directly connected to God in order to escape this. That's Psalm 32.
Yeah, but again, it doesn't answer the question. Why doesn't he stop these things? Why didn't he have Hitler die of a heart attack instead of going through the horror and the butchery that he did during World War II?
Well, like I was saying, the only answer I could give is that if he creates a reality, it has to be such where it's distinct and it will be imperfected, and therefore will have corruption. Things which are imperfected need to be improved, have corruption, and therefore any reality he creates will have to be of the imperfected nature and has to be saved, which is the whole point of the story of the Bible from start to beginning. That's why that you had corruption start with the first two sins, first Satan and then Eve, according to the biblical story. I realize not everybody believes that, but those happened by people taking their eyes off God. And first Satan took his eyes off God in Ezekiel 28 and looked at himself and was influenced by the things of the world rather than that which is perfected. So therefore he acted in an imperfected way, and therefore the first sin happened with him. And then Eve did the same thing, and then the whole world spirals out of control by Genesis 6, where you've got the Nephilim and so forth being discussed, and then a flood apparently has to happen because there's so much corruption in the world that many people have to be eradicated from, because there's a whole... Sorry?
But the people Hitler killed were not evil people. They were warm, loving, generally all of them, good people. They were, Jewish and other nationalities. I don't see any benefit that came from allowing someone like Hitler to live while they died. I mean, what did we learn from that? A horrible way for lessons learned.
I don't think there'd be any benefit to really. I would think the whole world, the only benefit there, in my opinion, the only benefit there is to having direct experience of God. It says in Ecclesiastes 1:2 that the whole world is meaningless, and the only point is to then, therefore, get your mind out of the world. That's, there's 1,000 verses, like Colossians 3:1 and 2, where it says that the point of our life is to directly experience God, to have our mind on the heavenly things.
See, we know that miracles happen, Jeff. I mean, people have prayed, and some remarkable things have happened. I mean, I am convinced of that 120%. But I don't get, as someone who's a believer in a higher power, I don't understand why we have to go through this kind of grief and sadness to learn things. I just don't know if there's the kind of God that so many people say there is, why it just doesn't step in and go, done, fixed, no more, without having to go through this this pain. I mean, we know little kids get cancer and they've died, yet others have had remarkable miracles. Why the difference? Maybe there's no answer.
Well, I could go into the answers. I think that some of that I got into a little bit last time. Why some are chosen for, some are chosen to have certain kind of lives, and others are chosen not to. And typically, those are the same that are in line with those who are chosen to go to heaven and those who are chosen not to. That's a very controversial issue, which is not often discussed in churches and so forth. But the whole Bible is filled with that idea that some are chosen, some aren't. Again, that's what I've got quite a bit in the book about that, and also my other book, Theologics, Chapter 1, is specifically about answering that. And just to put it in 10 seconds, the answer I came to, there's several answers to that I come to, but in Theologics, the first chapter, I come to the conclusion that God's the creator of infinities for several reasons. There's a whole argument about that in the new book, God Faith. And if he does, then he creates infinite worlds, infinite souls. Every possible, in philosophy it's called modal logic. Modal realism. Every single reality that can exist, God creates, and he will do so forever. He has been forever, and he will forever. From this point on, he'll create infinite realities. So therefore, every kind of soul that will exist is going to be created. So therefore, there has to be at least two kinds, those which are worthy for God to put his Spirit into, and those which aren't. And so therefore, you've got right there the big divide in reality of why if you have some beings who can't have their spirit put into by God, that means you're going to have a world such as ours where it's contaminated by sinfulness, evil, whatever word you want to say, pain, misery, and such.
Well, let me ask you this. You told us why you did not stay as an atheist, but why were you an atheist in the beginning?
For some of the big reason is because I didn't like life.
You mean personally?
I was in high school, and I was told, it was going to be a great life that I was going to have, and I get to go study computer science or something that I had no interest in, and then I had to work at this job for 10 hours a day for the rest of my life, and it just sounded like an absolute prison sentence.
So you blame God for that?
Well, in a way, yeah. I mean, I was in my teens and not very smart and so forth. And, I sort of put the two together. And when I got out of high school, I went to college for a few years and then dropped out. And I was married at the time. My wife and I moved to New Mexico, Albuquerque, great place.
Great, it is a great place.
Yeah, and I got into Buddhism because I really wanted to escape from reality.
And they believe in God.
Pardon me?
Buddhists believe in God. A higher power.
Indian Buddhists do, and when you get to Chinese and Japanese Buddhism later, they tend to be associated with atheists. I don't know if that makes much sense, but that's usually how they're classified.
Hold on for a second, Jeffrey. We're at the break, but we'll come back and talk more about this. The name of the book, God, Faith. The websites are linked up at coasttocoastam.com. And welcome back. Jeff Grupp with us with his latest work, God, Faith. He is a pastor, of course, working out of a jail in Kalamazoo, Michigan. What do the inmates generally come to you for, Jeffrey?
Well, I generally go see them. I'll just tour around the jail.
But they have to want you there, right?
No.
Or do you just walk in on them?
Yeah, well, I mean, there'll be a row of cells in any given place where I am. There's a number of different places. One, I was thinking before the show how to describe the jail if this came up. And one place, literally, George, is kind of like the Sounds of the Lambs. That where there's the glass doors, and so it's literally that crazy. I don't want to try to be dramatic or something for effect here. It's just nothing but the facts, and that's one of my favorite places to go. Actually, when you're serving God and you're having experience of God, you really want to sort of be I don't know. You want to go in those kind of places for some reason, the ultra impoverished and you're running a lot of people I would say are demon possessed and so forth. I mean, I've as I described on this show in 2015, I have a history of that in the late 90s, in my late 20s, sort of spontaneously bumped into that, and so I'm very familiar with that whole topic, and so I tend to go in those places where you find a lot of that and so forth. But it's but I'll generally just walk up and down cell blocks and just start talking. And sometimes I'll be shouted at, and I tend to, not want to start any fights or any argument or anything. It's generally a let's not cause confrontation.
I'll go do it. They're behind bars anyways, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're here to try to spread good news and make people, realize that there's hope. I mean, God, like I'll say to the guys, if you're sitting here in this cell, you got nothing else to do. You might as well pray all day today and realize every single moment you're praying that God is at every point in space all around you, including inside your body in his fullness. God isn't made of parts. God is one thing. So if he's everywhere, he means that his fullness is at every point in space. And just sit there and meditate on that and concentrate on that all day. That's the whole point of the part 3 of my book, which is you used to refer to it as a simulation theory. Now I call it non-physical Calvinism for a number of reasons. But it's sort of what for a number of reasons I go through in the book. I think that's the whole point of Christianity. I think that if you read carefully through many verses and whole portions of the Bible, people were experiencing the light of God all around. And it's sort of like some kind of sunlight that you're supposed to, in your inner being, in your inner mind, self, soul, or whatnot, you're supposed to directly experience. And if you read, like I said, if you read the Bible carefully, it's not really about, faith. A huge point in this book that I just wrote is to try to find out what this word faith means. Because for some reason, there's a lot of mysteries about Christianity. Like I just described what I said was a solution to the problem of evil. Whether or not people believe it or not, logically speaking, what I just said should be a rock-solid logical solution to the problem of evil. If God creates what is not God, you're going to get concentrations in the creation of the ungodliness, the not godliness, that will bunch up and accumulate and form densities, which will lead to evil, sin, whatever you want to call it. But another problem that I ran into is what in the world is everybody talking about faith as being a synonym for belief? Because the Bible doesn't say that at all. There's two words in Greek. There's one for belief and one for faith. They're not the same word that people are just interchangeably using throughout the Bible. You see this kind of a lot where the Bible will have two words come from Hebrew or Greek or whatnot, but people will sort of couple them together like they're synonyms. And, man, I'm telling you, there's a lot of damage done in a huge way by thinking that faith is just simply a synonym for belief. Now, faith is maybe 80% belief. That's one of the big ingredients, but there's some other things involved in it. For example, in Hebrews 11:1, it says that faith is evidence. And, man, George, I use this in the book, and I think I take down the entire edifice of contemporary atheism that is really a huge movement. You've got some massive players, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Matt Dillahunty, and so forth, that are out there. And I think what I write in this book absolutely destroys everything that they're doing. And curiously, I've been on a couple shows. I was on one show called the Non Sequitur Show, which is a nice one.
Interesting name.
Pardon me?
Interesting name.
Yeah. Isn't that perfect? That's a real good show. But I've had trouble getting on other shows, which I found curious. At first, people seem real eager to talk to me, but after I was on that show a couple of times, it's almost, I know they're watching each other's shows because they're on each other's shows. It's almost like they don't want to talk to me now because they see the ammunition that is packed here. For example, let me just get right to the point. The contemporary atheist will say that there's no evidence for the existence of God, so therefore the most logical position to hold is that there is no God. Now, can we prove there's no God? No, there's just no evidence, so it makes most sense to be an atheist. And I come at them and I say, wait a minute, you are not talking on the proper terms of Christianity is very specific in saying that there is absolutely no scientific evidence for God. It says in 2 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by faith, not by sight. That is exactly saying that there is no science. That's why we've never, when the atheist comes and says we've not discovered any scientific evidence for God, they're actually supporting the case of the Bible because it's exactly what the Bible says is going to happen. Now, I know there's a lot of groups out there, Answers in Genesis and so forth, that are trying to prove God with science. Now,
well, and you come
fine.
out.
I'm not saying what they're doing is, sorry?
You come out with some evidence in your book.
Well, I'm going with logical evidence.
Right.
And really I say in certain points that in chapter 5 that you really can't even, really what you want to have is your only evidence for God is direct experience of God. You're literally feeling the presence of God, seeing His being, His light in your mind's eye and so forth. And that's what I say in the book is what the word faith is supposed to mean. I mean, I just pile up the verses that say that. And somebody's going to have to explain to me why, if you get on YouTube and listen to the big pastors, like John Piper and so forth, that are supposed to really have, their research lined up properly, are not using these verses when they define faith. They just basically assume it means belief and then move on with whatever they're talking about. Because if you define faith in terms of evidence, not only belief, because you say evidence of what? Evidence means that you're experiencing something. It means that you have some kind of certainty. That's another word that's often used in Hebrews 11:1. You have certainty for that which is not seen. You have evidence of that which is not seen. So the question is what? And the answer is that which is unseen. So therefore, you have specifically a channel of information from God to the human which bypasses the senses. His direct mind implantation of God to the human of information. Well, what information? Well, James chapter 1, verse 21 says the Word of God, whatever God has to say, which really is not a kind of information. It says in 1 Corinthians 4:20, it says that the Word of God is power.
Would you say, though, Jeff, that most people who don't believe in God were raised that way?
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous Islamic philosopher. I forgot his name. It slips my mind. He made a great point. He said, all the little Jewish boys grow up and believe in their God, and all the little Islamic boys grow up and believe in their God, and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of cult. Definitely, you go into American churches and you see, my dad went to this church, and I go to this church, and my grandpa went to the church, and you see a lot of that, sure. But I mean, the point is, George. I mean, it says in the Bible, many are called, few are chosen. I mean, who really are those who have the information of God, the power of God? Is it really a cultural phenomenon? Maybe there's a lot of people that say that they're, they've got contact with God, that they know God, that and so forth, but really don't. It says in Matthew 7:13, 14, 15, says that the way is difficult and few find it. Many believe they do, but few find it. Maybe something like that's going on. So you could have huge numbers of people out there that think that they have direct, they're chosen, they're going to heaven, whatever you want to say, but really aren't. That's sort of a scary thing that people talk about. I think it's Matthew 7:23, 24, 25 talk about that. Many people think that they're part of God's program, but really aren't. So that would mean that there could be a lot of cultural phenomenon going on where people think that they're spiritual, but really it's just simply wearing. Jesus says in Luke 11:39, he says, people clean the outside of the cup, but leave the inside dirty. There's a lot of that going on.
That happens.
And then, interestingly, the verse after that, Jesus says, "But I've created both the inside and the outside." Now, I'll tell you, George, that right there, Jesus saying that He creates the inside, creates your subjectivity, your mind, your inner life, has unfathomable philosophical, metaphysical, theological consequences to it, which really dominate most of the book that I've written. Now, I don't even quote that verse in the book, but it's sort of understood. If God is the creator of all things, like it says in Revelation 4:11 and other verses, then He, your mind is the thing. He creates your mind. Now, wait a minute, George. I thought my mind was created by the world. I thought I was taking in information about the world. Why is it? What's the Bible saying here, implying that no, my mind is created by God? Is God using the world to create my mind? Or is it the case that God is just simply implanting information in my mind, because it implies that in a whole bunch of places, such as James 1:21, which I just quoted, that the Word of God is, for example, implanted into a person.
Well, let me go ahead. Go ahead. Finish that.
I was just going to say that, if everybody sits back and asks themselves, how much evidence do you have that the outside world exists? The answer is zero, because when you experience, let's go back to the cup again. Let's say you see a cup on the table. Where are you experiencing the cup? Are you experiencing the cup where it sits? Is your mind over there at the table? No, you're experiencing the cup in your mind. You experience everything in your mind. You never get out of your mind. This is a famous issue that philosophers have been talking about for hundreds of years, that all experience happens only in the mind. So we're stuck in our mind. So how do we know anything's outside of it? And the answer is we don't. There's zero evidence that there's anything outside of your mind. So therefore, if you're a supernatural creator, what would you do? Would you create consciousnesses to have experiencing, or would you create consciousnesses to have experiencing, and then a world of contradictory objects that exists outside of it for no reason whatsoever? They're not needed. They're just superfluous. Now, what do I mean by contradictory objects? Every single thing anybody sees right now, looking out at the world outside them, if you try to describe it, this has been known for 2,500 years since the philosopher Zeno, they're all describable by contradiction.
If you ask an atheist, how did we get here? What's their answer? What do they generally say?
They're going to take contemporary science and talk in terms of evolution, Big Bang, and so forth. Now, the problem is, though, is that doesn't prove atheism. The Big Bang could be true, and Christianity could also be true. Evolution could be true, and Christianity also could be true. Now,
Sure.
I don't believe in evolution, for example, but I mean, evolution does not disprove or prove Christianity. I talk about that in the book, chapter 6. The Big Bang is the same thing. A lot of people out there fighting about evolution, it's true, false, and this has something to do with religion. But it really doesn't, because the Bible is very specific in so many places, like we've said, of being independent of scientific issues. We walk by faith, not by sight. So our experience of God is a faith experience. Even the logical arguments that I give in the book, it's very interesting how the logic just lines up, where it would be the case that our reality, or really any reality we can conceive, is only describable by a Christian God. For example, we have the Christian God creates what is not himself. He creates the non-godly. The non-godly falls into, corruption. Now, think about it for a second. If God is perfect, absolutely perfect, then there's nothing can be added to him to improve upon him. Okay, because he's already infinite. He's already perfected. There's nothing you can add to perfect to make it more perfect. So then when God creates, he does it only for the benefit of the other. Okay, now that's the definition of Christian grace. Now, right out of simple logic of what it means to be a perfected creator, you have the idea that the perfected creator has to exhibit perfect grace. So right built into the logic of reality is a Christian metaphysics, a Christian ontology. Now, think of also the same thing again. The creation only happens one way, creator to the created. and of no benefit to the Creator, because He's already perfect. Has every. This is in the book of Acts. How it says we can't do anything to add to God. God only does things for us. Now that would mean that God is a perfect sacrificial entity. Now, wouldn't a perfect sacrificial entity also be described as a perfectly loving
It
entity?
should be.
So then again, you've got the Christian metaphysics built right into the logic of reality. So it's almost like now you might think, well, where does this all start? Why do we even know there's a God in the first place? Well, I got a few different.
Well, hold on for a second, Jeff. We're already at the top of the hour. We're going to come back and take some phone calls with you. We'll chat a little bit more about God, faith, your book. I also want to get your thoughts on the book of Revelation and whether you think we are close to end times. A lot of people think we are, but let's get your take on that. And then, of course, we'll take phone calls as well. Jeff Grupp, our special guest, website, simulationtheory.net, praiseandlove.net, all linked up at coasttocoastam.com. And welcome back. Jeff Grupp with us. His book, God, Faith. The subtitle, of course, is very important, Discovering the Pure Logic Built into the Fabric of Reality. Jeff, you, of course, have read the Bible a lot of times. What do you think of the book of Revelation? Are we near end times or not?
I don't think so, because it says in Matthew and Luke, but especially Matthew, like 17 to 26 in those chapters, that and it also Zechariah 14, it says we're supposed to see very specific signs, which at one point Jesus says, well, we know we'll be at the door for the end of the world, which means the sky splits in half and the whole deal. And we just aren't seeing those signs. There's not the proper war in Jerusalem, and certain things haven't happened astronomically with the sky and so forth. So no, I don't think so.
Well, that's a good thing. That is a good thing. I mean, you're gonna probably get some calls tonight from people who are atheists. How do you convince them otherwise?
I'm not concerned with convincing them, because I think that's not my job. I think that's God's job. If he wants somebody to be convinced, he'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
My job is just to simply. I mean, I discovered I bumped into Christianity through Buddhism. I mean, which is kind of crazy in itself. And right when I started, like I was saying earlier, when I got out of high school, I was depressed and so forth, and I ran into Buddhism. Pretty much right when I started studying Buddhism, I started having real specific, overwhelming, powerful experiences, mystical experiences, all through 1995 when I was 25 years old. They culminated in November of that year with an absolutely overpowering, say, 3-week experience of what I thought was supposed to be nirvana. There was just this omnipresent light everywhere that was I write about this in the intro to part 3 of the book, God, Faith. And it was an utter ecstatic experience. And it really sort of blew me away. And then I kind of went through this debate in my mind at a certain point late November of 1995, what is this? And I think in the book I use the example, when you're looking at a cat, you point to it and you say, what's that thing called? You say cat. You don't say cup or cloud or something, because, your mind registers word, world, assignment in a certain way. So I would say to myself, what is this light that I'm seeing everywhere? Because I've been hitting Buddhism like crazy. For about 2 years as an absolute fervent meditator of Zen Buddhism. And the only thing that matched up was God. But I was an atheist. So I had a major, and so I basically just said, no, it can't be what my mind is telling me it is, because there is no God. So I basically trusted my own logic rather than what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I guess the point here, George, is interesting. For me, I think this happens to other people too, maybe. For me, though, it was Buddhism that kind of got me into this whole, there's no question. It was the first thing. It took me about 10 years to really dislodge being an atheist. And it was really that experience that did it. Because when I went to, school I went back to school after this all happened. Got a degree in philosophy from New Mexico, and then went to Western Michigan and got a master's. While I was getting a master's there, I sort of dedicated everything to trying to research what this experience was that I had, all the publications that I had, and sort of culminating in this one article that I wrote called Mereological Nihilism, which is on my website in the CV section. sort of just trying to describe what this experience is. And it was publishing that article, which came out in 2006, which broke me being an atheist, because basically the research of the article proved to me that the mind, consciousness, is non-physical. And that's chapter 1 of my book, God Faith. And I think that's the best proof of the existence of a God. I mean, let's start over. Forget Christian God, anything. Just say we don't know anything. How do we find out if there's a God or not?
That's a tough question. I mean, we're here, so there's one possibility right there.
Well, I mean,
I don't think we're a fluke.
Go ahead, sorry.
I don't think we're a fluke. I don't think we're random. I think we were a process of some intelligence, and that's why we're here.
Okay. Many people, such as thousands of university professors, won't agree. They'll say, yep, we are a fluke, random processes, chance.
Too much
evolution.
order.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I hear you. What I do in the book is I start off the first page of chapter 1, and I say, if you look at your mind, you look inside it, you have something like a feeling. The feeling has no physical properties to it at all. It doesn't have, you can't say where it is, you can't say it has a size or extension or it exists in time. You don't know anything. It has no physical, everything we define is physical. It has none of those, in fact, it has the opposite properties. It's best, if you want to be most logical, you describe it as non-physical. You look at it, you stare at it for a bit, you're like, man, it looks like something that's the ingredient of a spirit. So what I do is I say in the first part of the book, I say, let's take, what do we know? We don't know if anything in the world is real or not, for the reasons I just gave. Now, I know some people think that's too uptight, but, hey, this is what philosophers have been concerned about with for a long time, for hundreds of years. That's Descartes' whole problem. The only thing that we really know is that we're a thinking being. So I start there. I say, if I look at my consciousness, it looks like a spirit. And only a spirit can create a spirit. So I'm created by a spirit. That's where I start. There's a two-stage proving that word created by God, specifically the Christian God. But that's where I start. And I think I'd like to see anybody.
Who created God, Jeffrey?
Well, God would be the only thing, by definition, that's uncreated. Now, some people may disagree with that. That's fine. But that is perfectly consistent to say that God is he existed always through time. If he's a thing that exists in time, he's everlasting. So he had no start. You could do the same. I know that there's some atheists that will say, for example, atoms. We're all say our universe is created out of atoms and so forth. You divide everything down into the smallest pieces. Now those could be eternal also. So often atheists will say, no, you don't need a God because you could have atoms, little teeny bits of matter that are uncreated as well. And so therefore you don't need a God because those will be eternal. That's sort of interesting. That's chapter 8 of the book.
All right, let's take some calls for you, Jeff. They're
sure.
lining up like crazy. Let's pick it up by going to Joe in Monterey, California to get things started. Hey, Joe.
Hi, George. Thank you for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
Jeffrey, I love the spirit in which you approach things, and what you keep saying is probably the bottom line. Experiences. I've been at this for a very, very long time, and my main thrust is to experience God directly. There are meditations, but basically out-of-body travel as soul, not astral body, but beyond the astral plane, what the Hindus call the absolute. And I've had some experiences in the absolute, and only once did I find an indication that there is a conscious being that was aware of me, not just a nebulous thing, but something that can take form only if it suits itself to impart some kind of experience. I will only tell of this one experience. We were doing a meditation, and the meditation or the practice was to see through the eyes of God. And most people can't do this, but I was lucky, and my experience was I saw dots of light, little dots of pinpoints of light. I eventually found out that this was soul, and it was showing me like billions and billions and just levels and levels and more. And it used two hands that it probably created for me so I don't get upset because it needed to part these worlds within worlds of soul. I didn't know that what I was seeing 20 years later, a friend channeled an angel because we talked to angels, and they said, you might want to read the Kabbalah, and it told me where to look. And I was reading this book, and there it is, souls entering the lower worlds, and it was the exact experience that I had. Now, as far as the absolute, one experience was in a world where it was all sound, and I was there for a fraction of a second. There's a particular exercise that I can do, that people can do if they choose to, and I found myself in that world, and it was painful. Well, it was a kind of a purification, and what I came away with was that this incredible sound, all these different sounds, incredible world, a universe, whatever it was, of sound, was always there. It was a reality. This was reality. What I experienced here was changeable, but this seemed permanent and forever. One more experience. I was doing another exercise, and I found myself in the absolute again, and my consciousness, this is not a body, it's just my awareness started to expand so rapidly that it was faster than thought itself. It was a rush. It took me by surprise. I was only there for a few seconds, and then I came back. These worlds, or these levels of God, which is referred to as the kingdom of God, not the kingdom of heaven, but the kingdom of God, it do exist from personal and direct experiences. And yes, I had validation from these higher beings like archangels and deities. On the road to this journey leads to experiences that are beyond a person's imagination.
Well, that is so true. And Jeffrey, there's a believer.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. I agree. You have to have experience. If somebody else tells you something like that, it's not going to do much good. You have to dive in and be completely transformed. And that's kind of the whole point of life, in my opinion. There's no, again, I'm very biased, but the whole purpose of life is to achieve the ecstasy of God. That's the whole meaning of. I've got a sign right above me, right here in my office. The meaning of life is seeing God. So.
Do you think some people, though, do not believe if something bad happens to them or their family members or something, and then all of a sudden their belief system goes out the window?
Well, yeah, I think that's how most people I see that were believers in God, and then
they changed
because of a tragedy or something.
In
no way would have God. But there are some who have a powerful experience of God where the opposite will happen. I've got a good friend in the jail, actually, that he had a major tragedy happen, and it increased his closeness to God, interestingly.
Let's go next to Mary in New Jersey. Welcome to the program, Mary.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I don't want to be preachy, but I believe what Christ said in the Bible, suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. I think you should read the Bible as soon as possible and just plant the seed into the child. God will take care of the rest. People censor God. They say, I can't read this to them. No, let God do the talking. Just keep, because people want to hold on to their children rather than give them over. They want little replicas of themselves walking around. It's not supposed to be like that. You're supposed to hand them to God, let him do the teaching. All right?
And welcome back to our final segment with Jeff Grupp as we talk about God, faith. Let's go to Wayne in Tacoma, Washington, west of the Rockies. Hey, Wayno, go ahead.
Good evening, gentlemen, Sir George and Jeff. Jeff, I can hear you're on the way to becoming a great Christian apologist like Ravi Zacharias. You're doing a fantastic job tonight, and I thank you for that presentation that you're giving. I know George earlier alluded to the world's problems, and why is the world the way it is? Fallen and sinful, and we have to look at what the Bible says, of course. The Bible clearly states that from the Garden of Eden on, we are in a fallen world, and the king and prince of that world is Satan, or Lucifer, the light giver. And I hear all these people talk about looking at the light and seeing lights. I'm a little leery of that myself, if you know what I mean. But I just wanted to again say you're doing a fantastic presentation of God's Word, and we got to look. History tells us that the Sadducees and the Pharisees. What did Jesus say to them? He said, "You are vipers and snakes." And other things he called them, and those were the religious leaders of the day. And basically, all religions of the world are the same. It's all do's and don'ts. Do my goods outweigh my bads? That's basically what all religions say. And this is where Christianity differentiates from religions. Christianity is not a religion. It's a relationship with God through his Son, Jesus Christ, through faith, by grace, through Christ alone. Jeffrey, God bless you. Thank you.
Take your bows, Jeffrey.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it's. I agree that the whole point of our lives are to have our eyes fixed on Christ, on God all the time. Then we have meaning. Then we have satisfaction. Then we have fullness and depth. And I think what you're looking at when you look at the world is the product of people who are not staring at God. That's what I define evil as. I differentiate sin and evil in the book, and I call evil taking your eyes off God. And I got a whole pile of verses because it says in the Bible God creates evil in many places in the Old Testament. So you got to do something about that. What in the world is that all about? And there's an explanation for it, basically meaning that God sustains the free will consciousness of angels and people, and he keeps them in existence while they freely choose to look away from him. And I call that God's creation of evil, which is, so anyway, it's an interesting issue.
Let's go to Mira in Los Angeles. Hi, Mira, go ahead.
Hi, George. Good evening.
Hi.
So I just wanted to offer my understanding of the existence of suffering based upon the biblical text.
Sure.
And so it says in Genesis, after the fruit has been eaten, it says, the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become as one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." So basically, as far as I understand, even God is not perfect. If you read the Old Testament, you'll see that he repents his anger. He repents even making human beings. But if you look in Jonah, the book of Jonah, he repents his anger for wanting to destroy the city, which he sent Jonah to save. And so when we think about suffering, we think often about the suffering of the flesh, and if we think about the story of the rich man and Lazarus, how the rich man has all his physical comforts, but Lazarus is favored by God just for what is in his heart.
Well, you're right about that, though, that God is presented in the Bible as angry in many cases, Jeff. Don't you agree?
Well, yeah, that's one of the attributes of God, omnipresence, and one is wrath. And that has something to do with that humans are different than him, and that we have sin. And in other words, we violate the ways of being like God, and that's the whole point, that we're not worthy of being alive anymore since we're different than God. And that's the whole point of the cross and so forth, which but yeah, that's a lot of these things. I mean, God is an infinite creator, and so a lot of this stuff is just beyond. I mean, I just gave a sermon called God is Mystery, and in a lot of ways that's to approach God with this great sense of unknowing, and realizing that he's just, in a way that, so therefore we're a mystery also. Humans are a mystery. If God is infinite and we're in his image, we're infinite too, but we're a smaller infinity, because, in Cantorian mathematics, there's different levels of infinity. I write about that in my book. So it's good to think of God as a great, something beyond. He's almost like a poem. He's far beyond what we can comprehend. And that's good news, I think, because then we can be absolutely humble in face of this incredible. It's like, this amazing openness that he represents.
Steve in South Dakota, let's get you here. Stephen, go ahead.
Hey, George, thanks for taking my call.
Sure thing.
I could talk for hours on God's purpose in my life. I believe that it is whatever, an ultimate being of pure unconditional love. And I have a higher power, and I choose to call him God.
Mm-hmm.
He's kept me alive because I let him into my life. We see the horrific days we're having today, and I believe that man is basically an animal. And this animal has free choice. God has allowed us to have free choice. But I believe that everything is for a purpose. I believe that God doesn't make mistakes. June the 12th, I had my 41st sober birthday. Been sober 41 years. And I learned how to drop my mask and share the real me. One of the things that kept me in trouble was that I thought I was unique. I was apart from everybody else. My story's different than yours. And so I stayed drunk,
Yeah.
In 1991, I had the opportunity to go to the state hospital here in South Dakota, down Yankton. And I worked for the South Dakota Arts Council. I did an artist in residency there for 3 months. And I worked with the geriatrically mentally ill and the kids and maximum security people. And I really learned that to keep it, you have to give it away. And last thing I'll say is there's a destiny that made us brothers. None walks his way alone. All that we send into the lives of others come back into our own. Thank you, George.
You're very welcome. And this is an emotional thing for a lot of people, Jeffrey, isn't it?
Yeah, really interesting calls tonight. The whole thing of relationship with God is absolutely gut-wrenching because it's always this interplay between the misery of our lives. And, and a lot of times we'll approach God as being invisible. Now, in my opinion, the more we're fixing our eyes on God, the more our life should be sort of this stream of miracles. Now, that may sound, a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, right. But no, it's really the case. That's my experience of my life. When I'm not distracted by the world, when I don't have my desires fixed on certain things, and when I am living in sort of a state of poverty, and nothing matters but God, me and my relationship with Christ, my life will flow from, I'm getting the streams of information that I shouldn't have, and miraculous things are happening. I'm seeing things that I didn't, you only think you'd see in the Bible or something, and that's really how life is supposed to be. We're supposed to be continually getting implanted by supernatural power from moment to moment. There's where your life has meaning. Otherwise, it's meaningless.
Jeffrey, in terms of living and dying, are you afraid of dying?
I know a lot of people, George, will say they're not, and it's like, oh, yeah, right. But I'm genuinely looking forward to dying. I just said that. I was praying with an inmate at the jail the other day, and I was like,
but you're not in any rush, right?
I want my kids to be taken care of and my wife to be taken care of and so forth. There's that issue. But other than that, no, I'm ready to go right now.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Well, when you say ready, you mean prepared or you want to?
No, I want to. I want to die. I'd prefer to be like Philippians 1:21, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain. That's what Paul said. There's many verses like that throughout the Bible. Death, where is thy sting? Now, because, if we really believe this and really experience God, you see the world is one way, and then what's beyond it is the source of the world is absolutely different, and you want that, not the world.
All right, once again, tell us where people can get the new book, God, Faith.
Oh, it's on Amazon. If you go to my website, praiseandlove.net, you'll see indications for it all over there. You can buy it directly from my site as well. You get it a little bit faster. It's not quite out yet on Amazon. It will be in a couple weeks.
Can you do you sign them if they get them through your site too? If they want a little autograph?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure can. Yep.
That makes it worthwhile. Okay, super. Jeff, thanks for being on the program. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And take care. And look, there's no question. There's something out there. There's a higher power. This isn't a fluke.